Welcome in, and thanks so much for joining me. So, in this episode, I'd like to discuss the challenges of opening our heart, opening to care, warmth, loving kindness towards ourselves and others when our, I guess we could say, sort of contraction is arising. And specifically, I'm going to ground this in some foundational Buddhist teachings. But, as with a lot of things I do, obviously you don't have to be Buddhist to enjoy this and benefit from it. You don't even really have to believe in Buddhism necessarily to benefit from this. And the reason is we can actually analyze and or reflect or check to see if the way Buddhism describes our what we normally call like our afflictive emotions, the emotions that cause us and others the majority of our suffering, the majority of our dissatisfaction and stress. If we can kind of see that somehow, these are universal. They're not just something that we experience or others experience. They're not necessarily religious, and they're not necessarily not religious. They're just part of human life. But of course, as usual on this YouTube channel and my podcast, as well as the rest of my content, I do frame things within the context of traditional Buddhism because this is what I benefited the most from. And I think the framework's very useful for us to understand more about our human experience and how to reduce and remove stress and suffering. So with that said, this framing in the traditional Buddhist path usually goes into what are called the 5 afflictive, or sometimes they're called the poisonous emotions. Poisonous in the sense that when we feed them, when we give them more energy, when we give them more of our time and attention, they actually deceive us and eventually lead to more dissatisfaction. So as I already said, this isn't something obvious with some of these emotions. And it's not saying all emotions are bad, right? It's just saying that when we, again, feed, energize, bring more attention to, act from these afflictive emotions, we suffer more, essentially. So these 5 afflictive emotions are the root, which we call misperception, sometimes ignorance, from the Sanskrit word avidya, which kind of also implies some unawareness. So it's like an unawareness about how our mind functions, our emotions function, how various kind of phenomena, ways of being, I guess we could just say the workings of the world and mind, some kind of unawareness of this, or misperception, or ignorance. And, this is where foundational compassion and love come in, because it's not something we did on purpose. It's not something we're trying to do on purpose. It's just part of the human experience we need to understand, and we can remedy through the rest of the path, including our meditation practice. So with that said, the other 4 major afflictive emotions kind of stem from this root unawareness or misperception. But again, I'll introduce them and then we'll go into a little bit more detail. So the second would be intense craving or clinging energy. And this doesn't mean, I guess we could say, positive forms of love and care in relationships we have in our life. More it's referring to that clingy, craving energy that just won't let us be at peace, right? Like we really have to have it now, and we'll do anything to get it. And we can see, in some cases, certain things are easier to let go of. Like, let's say our favorite restaurant was closed. Okay, bit of a bummer. We just go to another one, right? In some other instances, we can see this as like incredibly painful. When we are in love with someone, or when we've been in love with someone and then that partnership ends, or whatever, we can see the craving arises a lot, and we suffer a lot from that. So that's kind of 2 ends to think about, and then a lot in the middle, right? So then the next one is aversion or anger. And I would say this is kind of the obvious starting point if we're looking at these and reflecting on them in a really open way to see if these are true, if it's true that these actually do create a lot of problems for us. Anger or aversion is probably the easiest one to see because, sure, when we get angry with someone, we can hurt them through our words or physical actions. But generally, most of our anger and aggression and aversion harms us because when we get heated, when we get angry, we immediately get stressed out. We immediately don't feel at ease or at peace. It can have, harmful effects on our health, as you know. And so there's a lot of consequences of this. So just saying that, so when we're reflecting on these, we can sort of work with what's a little bit more easy to see first, and then we can go into more difficult things like ignorance and or misperception or avidya. That's probably the hardest one to see, and we often need to meditate for quite a while to have some understanding and experience of that a little bit more. But anyways, moving on from these three root afflictive emotions, we then have jealousy and pride. And so jealousy we can also see as a form of clinging and aversion. So it's based on the previous two. And it also creates a lot of dissatisfaction. We lose our peace, we want what that other person has, or, whatever we perceive from them. And we don't feel good enough. It's actually, as one of my teachers said, and please don't take offense to this, I just really like how he said it because it affected me in a positive way, where it made me want to not feed or, put more attention into my jealousy. And he called it basically a loser emotion. And what he wasn't calling me or anyone else a loser. He was just saying when we're in that state, it's like we're losing all the time, right? We're just in that sense of like, I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. I wish I had what they had, whatever the thing is. So we can see jealousy quite clearly as not, there's not really a positive aspect to it. And then pride, pretty subtle for most of us, because pride doesn't just mean when like someone's blatantly arrogant. It can be as subtle as just this sense of autonomous self that it, feels slightly above another person, right? So this happens all the time to us, in lots of different kinds of situations. We often remedy that with meditation and equanimity. But either way, we can start to see, pride or arrogance in all of its flavors as a form of pain. And again, we're going to start with seeing these 5 afflictive emotions as painful for oneself. I find that to be not only a starting point, but a place to come back to often, because if we don't do that, sure, it's great to think about others. I mean, that's the point too, is to care for others, to, be more of a peaceful person in the world, to not harm others, etc. But if we also don't see how these harm ourselves, I think it lacks some depth, right? So I've seen this with myself, where early on, in my Buddhist studies and practice, I could see, okay, yeah, I don't want to engage in these 5 afflictive emotions and hurt anyone, right? But over the years, I continued to hurt myself through them. And of course, for those of you hearing this for the first time and you're kind of having some light bulbs go off about how, this is structured and how these root emotions, which by the way, branch into many other kinds of states of mind and emotion, but you're starting to see some light bulbs are going off that these are detrimental to you. I just want to start with like, these will probably not go away quickly. So it's not like, oh, I watched the video, now I'm not going to have these anymore. These are deeply entrenched states of being. But the Buddhist path and its sort of positivity, usually as part of the medicine, it points out the disease, which is these 5 afflictive emotions. And then it starts to provide medicine through the path of, understanding, reflection, and meditation to start to extricate or remove our habits and our relationship to these afflictive emotions. And instead, we encourage positive emotions like loving kindness, patience, although patience isn't quite an emotion, it's more of an action, but, loving kindness, compassion, etc. We start to feed these. So actually, sometimes what Buddhism prescribes is just feed more loving kindness, just sort of pay more attention to that. Connect with compassion more, act out of compassion more. And then naturally, the afflictive emotions will also lessen. But either way, this is kind of an introduction to what I really want to talk about, which is how do we open our hearts to ourselves, to others, in a world that is sort of plagued by these afflictive emotions? How do we work with our judgment of others and maybe, how do you say it, when we get really down or just overwhelmed, despondent about a lot of the pain in the world, a lot of the ways others act. And as I already said, I think one starting place with this when we're getting despondent is actually to work more on our side of the street, because this is immediately available. It's not the easiest thing to do, obviously, but it's immediately available. We don't need to convince anyone of anything else. No one else has to change necessarily, but we put energy into transforming and changing. And a lot of people might not like that answer, and I understand why. I think for me, I didn't like that answer for many years, maybe the first half of working with the Buddhist path more seriously. Maybe the first 10 years of studying and practicing, it was just sort of more centered on sort of how do I have an immediate effect in the world, and how do I see an outcome to this? So this is kind of the first thing I want to bring up, because this is kind of something we need to question, because a lot of our modern education, a lot of the way the Western world is set up, and anywhere that influences, is to focus on outcome, is to focus on immediate change. And if that's not happening, then our fundamental thesis is flawed, right? And this is not really the way the Buddhist path works, essentially. Of course, we're working on our own afflictive emotions and trying to reduce harm to ourselves as well as the way we treat others. Of course, we're trying to have an effect. We're trying to have some measurable kind of outcomes on our conduct and our relationship to others. Of course, we want that. And of course, we need to measure that at some point. But too much obsession over that, what I've seen for myself and others, is it kind of thwarts the progress a little bit more. Where when we focus more on our side of the street, when we keep it there a little bit more, what this often does is it makes us immediately accountable. It also makes us really in touch with the pain of these afflictive emotions. And this is kind of my main point for this episode. If we're not in touch with the pain of these afflictive emotions, what actually happens is kind of insight, or maybe some understanding about these, about others, how they affect us, how they affect others, how they affect sort of, all kinds of things, politics in the world, economies, etc. But without compassion, it ends up usually going into a heavy bias of judgment, where we could actually start to build up more aggression and anger towards ourselves and others. So my take here is that we need to spend a lot of time feeling the impact of these afflictive emotions on our thoughts, on our bodies, like on our physical sensations, on our actions, on sort of like what has come about in our life, in our current situation in our life so far, when we feed and give more attention to these afflictive emotions. And doing that with a sense of allowing the heart to break open. So those of you who listen to me often on my podcast, YouTube channel, or read my blogs, you've heard this phrase from me where I recommend using meditation and the Buddhist path as a way to break the heart open, not to break it down. And what breaking open means is allowing a sense of sadness for the confusion of ourselves and others, for the very entrenched, stuck habit patterns of these afflictive emotions of, clinging, craving, aversion, pride, jealousy, and then the root, which is just a confusion that those are problematic in the first place. Often, for a lot of us, myself included, that's the real issue. We're so habituated to these in many ways that there's just even the confusion that they're harming us in the first place. So the first step is to pay attention more, to use our mindfulness and awareness to pay attention more to our own side of the street, how these arise within our minds and our bodies, and to give space for them in meditation. When we practice awareness in meditation, we're creating more space, or the container that everything's arising and falling within. And the more we do that in meditation, we're not trying to get rid of things, we're trying to see how they are. And of course, this takes guts, this takes perseverance, this takes kind of a willingness to be with the, as I say sometimes, like be with the suck, be with the things that, we don't necessarily like so much. But our goal, our intention is a compassionate one, to learn, to grow, to transform over time for the benefit of ourselves and others. So this is really key, because then with that willingness to be with a broken heart for ourselves and others, the judgment lessens, the insight and compassion grow, and then we actually make progress in working with these afflictive emotions. Progress doesn't mean perfect, right? But it means that we are actively working with them. We're seeing that they are not helping us, and then we're trying to learn other habit patterns in their place. And that's not a mystery. I already said it. We're trying to encourage more care, more love, more compassion. Of course, in some relationships, this is going to be easier than others. But as I've said, our relationship with ourself here is the primary one in the beginning. If you're a person with like very little of these 5 afflictive emotions, congratulations. Probably you could just sort of integrate your work a little bit more into working with others. I mean, we all have to do both, right? In the end, I don't really see a huge difference when we're working with ourselves. That ends up becoming how we are with others, if you know what I mean, right? So it influences our habit patterns and how we interact with the world around us. So actually, the distinction between one or the other isn't necessary ultimately, but a lot of us are experts at bypassing our own experience. We read these very high teachings in Buddhism or other spiritual paths and traditions, and then we skip the step of actually doing the work, which is the spiritual bypass. So in that sense, it's really necessary to work with our own side, right? Then we're at much less risk of bypassing our own experience, and then it can have this more positive long-term impact, not only on our own well-being and peace, but on how our peace affects the peace in the world. So with that said, I do recommend some kind of a meditation practice for this. And, depending on where you're at with that, if you're a beginner or more intermediate or more advanced, really any practice done with an intention of love and compassion, done with an intention to cultivate mindful awareness, is going to be beneficial. And then we're often working with the bypass at that point, right? Because none of us like to feel pain. And so when we see these afflictive emotions in our minds, in our hearts, in our actions, that can be painful. So I just want to say that also needs to be included in the compassion, in our heart breaking open, right? The breaking down is when we start judging ourselves, when we start judging others, when we start, I don't know how you say, like, just getting stuck in sort of, poor me, I'm this bad person, or I'm this not worthy person. And again, that comes in many, many flavors, right? So we need to be aware of that, so we don't thwart the practice, and also just sort of stay stagnant in it, right? So that's easier said than done. I also struggle with that. When I do something that I regret, yeah, it's tough. I mean, there's positive regret. Regretting something can be very positive, but then, we have to be careful not to fall into this sense of ourself as what I call sort of a permanently bad person. We have to recognize, okay, I made a mistake, or I made a mistake in the past, and I don't want to repeat that, and I want to change. I want to make amends if I can. And I want to learn, what is the cause of this? And this is what the Buddhist path is saying. The cause is these 5 afflictive emotions. And so when we uproot them, and when we can recognize them, we can start to engage in them less and less. And as I said, engage more in loving kindness and compassion as our base for how we're interacting with the world. So I think I'll end it there. I hope this is helpful. And as always, I really, really invite your reflection and feedback. If you want to comment on my YouTube channel, wonderful. If you just want to send me an email, you can always do that through my website at scottdusa.com. And wishing you the best. I think for me, this is like kind of the core of it all. If this isn't happening, I'm not sure what is really the point of a spiritual path or meditation or any kind of personal work for that matter. Because again, I'm not trying to convince you of my belief, but for me, when I look around the world and look at all the problems we're going through, look at my own problems, these 5 afflictive emotions are at the core, right? Of myself, of others, of the others around me. And so when we see that, it's like something we can't unsee, but we have to make sure it doesn't go into the judgment department and it goes more into the compassion department, which actually has a lot of agency in it. I can be quite a judgmental person at times. And what I've found is that judgment really doesn't have much agency. Maybe a little bit in the beginning because we can kind of make a quick change. But compassion is that long-term agency that keeps us peaceful, light, open to ourselves and others, and very discerning. Wisdom can arise from compassion. So thanks so much. Take care.